She screamed so loudly that the walls shook. The cry of Princess Isabella de Lausanne, daughter of a powerful family, could be heard far beyond the palace walls. Later accounts said she was held down with straps, and the executioner's knife touched the source of her femininity and strength. Her clitoris was cut off, and the flesh was cut up, as if to remind everyone that even noble blood couldn't protect her from a painful punishment. This moment marked the beginning of the end, although the execution itself had not yet taken place. She was kept in torture chambers, bleeding to death, and gradually turning into a living warning to all who dared to oppose the will of the court and the Holy Church. Chronicles from the end of the 14th century have preserved excerpts from the guards' reports, which mentioned blood flowed continuously, her bandages had to be changed every 2 hours, and the smell of iron mixed with the rot of the wound. Servants recorded that doctors prescribed bloodletting in small portions twice a day to cleanse the bad juices, although the condemned woman was already losing strength from the incessant blood loss. Leeches were placed on the inner surface of her thighs for a quarter of an hour to draw out the inflammation. Cauterization was performed on specific points above the pubic area, explaining that it was necessary to stop the spread of pus. Ointments were prepared from lard, ash, and crushed herbs, and rubbed in 3 times a day, but they only caused burning pain. Opium grains were given at dawn, and poppy syrup was given 2 spoonfuls before bedtime. All this was recorded in the doctor's notes, where each observation was brief: weak pulse, gray tongue, cloudy urine, foul-smelling sweat. The room where she was transferred after torture gradually turned into a decaying cell. The felt under her body was soaked with secretions, cracks formed on her heels, and ulcers appeared on her skin. Soldiers of different surnames took turns at the door, checking the lists of those allowed in. The keys were kept by the prison warden, but at night, trusted priests made their way through a secret passage in the walls to hear her confession. Isabella begged for mercy, promising to give her lands to charity. But the answer was the same: the execution had to take place, and the cutting off of her clitoris was only a prelude to the final sentence. Meanwhile, a struggle was brewing in the halls of the palace. The old nobility insisted on the immediate conclusion of the trial in order to quell unrest in the provinces. The new entourage, associated with the French crown, was playing for time. They wanted to use Isabella's death as a political symbol to weaken the Lozano family and redistribute their lands. Secret meetings broke out between supporters of the strict line of the Inquisition and those who saw a chance to renew their power. The ambassadors of Burgundy and Savoy sought access to the princess, claiming that she could change her will in their favor. Every day, the guards wrote down who had tasted her food, who had examined the seals on the jugs of water and wine, and where the seals in the hiding places had been replaced. In the notes of one of the priests, preserved in the monastery archives, we read, "She lay staring at the ceiling, her lips moving without words. When we asked her to repent, she said she did not believe in forgiveness. She asked only for water to moisten her lips, but the guards brought her a decoction of bitter herbs, which increased her thirst. At night, braziers were brought into her cell to dispel the stench, but the smoke only intensified her cough. Inflammation grew in her body. Her perineum was covered with festering ulcers, and the decay spread to her internal organs. Witnesses testified. Her body refused to hold urine. Her clothes were constantly soaked, and the felt under her had to be changed 3 times a night. Each change of linen became torture. Servants tied her down with straps to turn her over, and many refused to come near her because of the stench. But along with her physical decline, her suspicion grew stronger. In those rare moments when the pain subsided under the influence of poppy syrup, Isabella demanded paper, dictated her will, changing the names of her heirs, then revoked what she had said, suspecting that the scribes were serving her enemies. Rumors spread that some of her orders were being forged. The signatures were written in the prisoner's trembling hand, but the wording was changed by her advisors. Tension grew within the castle walls. Some claimed that she was already insane and unaware of what was happening. Others said that her ravings contained prophecies, that she had seen monks with their penises cut off, and women whose vaginas had been cut out, a harbinger of future executions. Witnesses noted that these words terrified even hardened warriors. She survived against all medical predictions. When she was considered ready to die, her breathing became steady again, and her eyes opened. Her body was rotting, but her voice was still audible. And that was the most frightening thing. The dying princess, covered in pus, continued to give orders, curse her enemies, and demand loyalty. By the end of the first week of her siege, her chambers could no longer be aired. The guards at the doors held rags to their faces, and the priests tried to limit their visits, but no one dared to give the order to end her suffering. Isabella's death was to be a political event, and each side was preparing to use her demise for its own ends. And while in the upper halls of the palace, discussions were underway about the inheritance and fate of the lands, down below, in the cold chambers, the princess continued to rot alive, unaware that her suffering was only the beginning of a much larger struggle. By the end of her second week in captivity, Princess Isabella of Lausanne was unable to get out of bed. Servants noted in their reports, her wounds have opened, the edges have turned black, and the tissue is eaten away by pus. Her perineum oozed a constant stream of fluid with a pungent smell of decay. Attempts to cauterize with iron or apply ointments made from lard and ash no longer stopped the spread of the ulcers. The skin around them was yellow with gray spots, and at night worms emerged from the wounds. The doctors continued to prescribe bloodletting in small portions twice a day, assuring her that the bad juices could still be removed. Leeches were applied to the inner thigh and groin, leaving bite marks and intensifying the pain. Herbal compresses were changed every half hour and applied for an hour, but the fabric was instantly saturated with pus. Her pulse was weak, her urine was cloudy and foul-smelling, her tongue was dry, and her breathing was wheezy. The doctors wrote heart heat, night sweats, fever, followed by chills. By dawn, the opium grains were no longer effective. She screamed and thrashed about, tearing off her bandages, and the guards were forced to tie her to the bed with straps. 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup before bedtime only caused delirium and visions. She often repeated that she saw saints turning away from her and demons laughing, showing severed limbs and penises thrown into the fire. Those around her were increasingly afraid to approach her. The servants began to bribe the guards so that they would not bring night lamps to her cell or change her soaked linen. The guards wept from the stench and complained that the air in the chambers was heavier than lead. Several refused to serve and were publicly flogged in the courtyard. Meanwhile, political intrigues intensified in the upper halls of the palace. The Lozano family secretly tried to arrange a meeting with the captive to force her to confirm her previous will. The old nobility claimed that the princess's true will had been falsified by her new entourage, which was connected to the French crown. The Savoy ambassadors offered gold to the military guards in exchange for letting them into her bedchamber. At night, the guards at the cell door were changed. First, men from the Montfort family stood watch. Then they were replaced by soldiers from Burgundy. Each guard had a list of those who were allowed to enter. Only the prison warden had the keys to the door, but reports said that priests had entered Isabella's cell several times without his knowledge. Her confessions became increasingly difficult. She said she did not believe in the forgiveness of sins. When asked for mercy, she replied that God had turned away from her. When asked about politics, she raved about the names of her enemies and ordered the punishment of those who sat in the upper halls. Her voice was hoarse, but her orders were recorded, and some of them were brought to meetings, causing fear and confusion. Rumors spread throughout the city. Some said that the princess was still alive and whispering of revenge. Others claimed that she had died long ago, and that her body was being hidden until negotiations over the lands were completed. Merchants said that a foul odor emanated from the prison windows at night, and that rats flocked to the walls. Doctors predicted her imminent death, but she continued to breathe. Each dawn found her in even worse condition, but still alive. She was losing her sight. Her eyes were covered with a film, but sometimes she would suddenly open them and look at the servants, forcing them to cross themselves and look away. Later, treatises wrote, her body was so emaciated that doctors could not touch her groin without vomiting. The stench was so strong that candles smoked and went out. But even in this condition, she tried to dictate new entries in her will, changing the distribution of her lands. This caused new conflicts. Some demanded that her execution be hastened, while others wanted to delay it so that her name could be used as a weapon. Secret reports said, every day of her presence in the world, dead in body but alive in voice, keeps the entire nobility in fear. It was then that the first suspicions arose that some of her words were being falsified. Copyists added the names of advantageous heirs, attributing them to her words spoken in delirium. The guards recorded the nightly visits of scribes who left the cell with sealed scrolls. Isabella rotted and moaned, but her name had already become a subject of trade and threats. Each new day of her torment intensified the struggle, and she herself continued to exist. A reminder that physical decay does not always mean the end of power. The third week of her imprisonment was the time when her body and mind finally began to diverge. Isabella de Lausanne could no longer sit up or speak coherently, but she was still alive. The guards wrote, her eyes are cloudy, her breathing is wheezy, her lips are black, and her tongue is swollen and does not fit in her mouth. She moaned, but these sounds were still perceived as orders. The scribes leaned over her face and claimed to hear names, orders, and curses. Others swore that it was meaningless gibberish, but the papers with her words continued to multiply, and on their basis, the parties divided the Lausanne lands. Her physical condition became a weapon of fear. Reports said, the flesh of her perineum has split open, the edges are blackened, and worms are swarming inside. Servants tried to wash the wounds with vinegar, but the stench only grew stronger. Pus oozed through the bandages and dripped onto the floor. Night rats gnawed at the fabric, and once a servant, turning her body over, noticed bite marks on her thigh. The bed on which she lay had rotted, and the boards beneath it were covered with slime. The bedding was changed daily, but each new one was soaked within a few hours. The servants began to draw lots to determine who would enter her chamber. Those who refused were flogged. Several servants died of fever, and there were whispers that the princess's bodily contagion was spreading. Her mind finally left reality. She whispered about saints who turned into demons, about women with their breasts and wombs cut off, about monks with holes where their faces should have been. Sometimes she screamed that she could hear the laughter of her enemies feasting above her bed. The priests recorded these words as proof of possession and demanded that her execution be hastened to cleanse the land of defilement. But the king's advisors would not allow it. They saw political advantage in her suffering. Each night of her living decay meant time for negotiations, time to put pressure on the Lozano family and their allies. Rumors of her suffering spread throughout Europe. Ambassadors from Florence and Naples wrote of the living dead princess whose body was rotting in the castle. Servants said that at night, candles crackled and died from the stench in her cell. One of the guards swore that he saw a worm crawl out of her mouth and fall to the floor. Another said he heard her laughing in the darkness, even though her mouth was stuffed with her swollen tongue. Her body became a symbol. Soldiers whispered that until she died, there would be no war. But there was horror in this too. Her death was being delayed, as if she were holding the balance. When the doctors gathered around her bed once again, they wrote, "The body reeks of a corpse, but the heart is still beating." This became the subject of new rumors, that she was cursed, that neither death nor God would accept her. And yet every morning, her name was heard again in the upper halls. Advisors discussed who would get her inheritance. Papers multiplied. Signatures were signed with trembling hands. But no one could say any more where her will ended and forgery began. Isabella rotted and raved, but remained the center of the world. Her breath, with its wheezing and moaning, was the lifeblood of political struggle. And everyone knew that her end would not be just death. It would be a flash that would change the fate of houses, provinces, and perhaps the entire kingdom. The guards noted that Isabella's breathing had become rare and hoarse, with pauses of 10 to 20 heartbeats. Doctors noted her skin is yellow, her lips are blue, her eyes are cloudy and do not close even in sleep. Her body no longer responded to injections, but her heart continued to beat. She hardly spoke, only a few sounds: sin, light, flame. Priests brought her confession every day, but no one was sure if she could hear them. Doubts remained. Would God forgive a woman who had her clitoris cut off in the square as a sign of debauchery? Some insisted that her suffering would atone for everything. Others said she was doomed. Her perineum was completely rotting. The bandages were changed every 2 hours. The doctors wrote, "The ulcers have spread to the anus and groin. The tissue is falling off in pieces. The smell is unbearable." Leeches, which they tried to put on her thigh, fell off dead. They stopped bleeding her. The blood no longer clotted and flowed out on its own. Servants refused to enter the room. New ones were taken from among the beggars, promising them freedom from taxes. Several died of fever after 3 or 4 days of service. Rumors spread that the princess's body is contagious. Meanwhile, a struggle raged around her bed. The old families insisted that her signatures on the wills were invalid, claiming that she was not in her right mind. Her new entourage, on the contrary, claimed that she had spoken every word in the presence of witnesses, and that this was the law. Ambassadors from France demanded a share of the land, based on her alleged verbal promise. The Spanish threatened to support those who wanted her to be executed quickly if they were not allowed to participate in the negotiations. The guards at her chambers changed every day, sometimes twice a day. The keys to the door were kept by the commandant, but one night a fake key was found among the supporters of the old nobility. It was clear that everyone wanted Isabella dead, but each camp wanted to arrange the timing of her death to suit itself. Her body became an object of fear and power at the same time. Servants reported that some advisors came to her at night and, thinking she couldn't hear them, whispered the terms of her will. In the morning, they brought papers with her crooked marks and passed them off as her last will and testament. With each passing day, she grew weaker. The bones of her pelvis protruded, and bed sores the size of a palm appeared on her legs. She urinated continuously, mixed with blood and pus. The smell was so bad that candles went out on their own, and yet her heart continued to beat. One night, as recorded in the guard's report, she suddenly opened her eyes and screamed, even though her tongue was swollen. "They're lying!" After that, she fell back into delirium. But on the same day, her old associates hastened the negotiations. Rumors of her consciousness threatened to ruin their plans. The doctors admitted she is already dead, but her soul will not leave her body. This was considered a sign of a curse. The priests advised holding a solemn funeral service while she was still alive to force her soul to leave her body. But the royal council postponed it. They needed one more night, one more signature. In the evenings, only one scribe, one guard, and one priest remained at her bedside. The rest did not dare to stay. Everyone was afraid she could die at any moment, and no one wanted to be the first witness. But death still did not come. Isabella de Lausanne continued to rot, continued to suffer, and each breath she took was a new delay in the political explosion. Isabella de Lausanne's death came at the end of winter. By that time, her body was a rotting mass. The skin had slipped off her bones. Her perineum had decomposed down to the pelvic bone after her clitoris had been cut off, and a foul-smelling liquid mixed with blood flowed from her vagina. Hand-sized ulcers appeared on her skin, and her tongue was swollen and blackened. According to doctors' records, in her last days, her heart continued to beat for several hours after she stopped breathing, but there was no pulse in her wrists. The guards noted. At night, the smell became so bad that even the guards coughed and cried, and the candles went out by themselves. She died without witnesses, except for a priest and a scribe. Even her closest associates were not allowed into her chambers. They feared contagion and political rumors. The scribe's report states, at 2 o'clock after midnight, she uttered an incoherent sound, stretched out her hand, and then froze. The priest read a short prayer over her without touching her body. Removing the body proved to be a challenge. The servants refused. Then 4 men sentenced to death were brought in. They were promised a reprieve. They wrapped the body in felt, but the fabric fell away onto the floor. The captain of the guard reported, the stench was so bad that people fainted, and the dogs in the courtyard howled. The embalmers were unable to work. The internal organs were already decomposing. Almost all the blood had drained out, and the smell was so bad that they had to go out into the fresh air every quarter of an hour. The records state, the heart could not be removed, the liver crumbled in our hands, and the skull could not be opened due to the decay of the tissue. A political explosion followed immediately. Her old entourage declared that her last signatures were invalid. Her mind was clouded before her death. Her new entourage showed papers with her crooked marks and swore that they were genuine. French ambassadors claimed that a verbal promise of land had been made and must be fulfilled. The Spanish claimed that death, without proper burial, invalidated the will. Rumors spread throughout the city. Some said that the execution with the cutting off of her clitoris was the cause of the curse, and that was why her body would not be accepted by the earth. Others said that she had died a holy martyr, and that her suffering had atoned for the sins of her family. The crowd in the streets was divided. Some demanded mass executions of those guilty of power, while others honored her memory by bringing candles to the palace gates. The chronicles note that during the first 7 days after her death, 3 guards were replaced, 3 forged wills were opened, and 2 groups of nobles began to prepare for armed action. Thus, the death of Isabella of Lausanne, humiliated and mutilated by public execution, was not the end, but the beginning of a new chaos. Her decomposing body was taken to a monastery, but even there the monks complained of a stench that lingered for weeks. The people remembered her not as a princess, but as a woman who had her clitoris cut off in the square and who rotted alive in her own chambers. For some, she became a symbol of God's punishment. For others, a martyr. But for the nobility and ambassadors, her death was just a convenient excuse to divide power and land. Thus ended a life that began in grandeur and ended in complete isolation, filth, and fear.